Good afternoon. It's really wonderful to be here at the the Global Family Reunion. It's such a diverse group of people, and it's so different from the usual genealogy conferences. It's been great to meet all of you, and I hope today that you learned something about your family photographs from this presentation, where's the clicker? Went forward, oops. So throughout my years of studying photographs, I have seen many fascinating details in 19th century pictures. But it's often the hair and the hats that stand out, that tell us something about the person in the photograph, that not only helps us date the photo, but helps us learn about their personality or politics or the places that they lived. Point in fact, if you look at the woman on the top right, in this slide with that very funny hat, and you're allowed to laugh because I put in a lot of funny pictures in here. Our ancestors had a wry sense of humor sometimes when they got dressed in the morning. But in fact, that hat tells us exactly where she lived in Europe. She lived in Maison, France. And that's her everyday go-to-market hat, worn in that little area. So if you had no idea at all where that ancestor was from, that hat tells you everything you need to know. The rest of the details in the photograph tells me that it was taken in 1870. The man in the middle, he's wearing also sort of work clothes, but that under the chin beard and the outfit that he wears tells me that that photograph was likely taken in the 1850s. Or early 1860s. We'll see the woman in the bottom right a little later in this presentation. So we're going to talk about ways to jumpstart your photo ID. And I thought the best way to do it was to have some fun with fashion, hats and hairs, and everything else we're going to talk about. Look at these two guys. They're dirty. Their clothes is worn out. And yet, they've gone to the photo studio and posed for a picture. Why? Perhaps it documents a job that they finished. What do they bring into the photo studio with them? Their tools. What do they do with those tools? Does that give you a clue as to your ancestor's occupation? I don't know exactly what those tools represent. I've had a lot of people kick out theories about what those tools are. We think, the collective we, is that they are bricklayers, and those are tamping tools for tamping down the bricks. And perhaps they just finished a major public works project and went to have their picture taken. It is a daguerreotype, the very first type of photograph that our ancestors posed for. It's shiny and reflective. You have to hold it at a 45-degree angle in order to view it. They're only available between 1839 or 1840 as people in the picture, and about 1860-65, depending on where your ancestors lived. So if you see one of those very shiny, reflective images, you know that that picture was taken between 1840 and about 1865. It's the other details in the picture that will help you narrow that time frame even further. Who took the picture? Is there a photographer's mark on it? What type of case is it? What are they wearing? Oops, that advanced all by itself. Sorry about that. The other thing is, I like to have fun with our ancestral photos, and I'm a big reader of People magazine because I travel a lot and it makes the time pass on the plane. And AJ actually had a column in People magazine for a while about famous relatives, and we're all cousins. But if you look at these hats, now this picture was taken in the 1840s, if I hadn't mentioned that yet. If you look at their hats and you're familiar with a song called Happy by Farrell, and you see a picture of Farrell's wearing that hat. He thinks he's so trendy. He's so 1840s, though. In the 1850s, clothing changed a little bit, and this, every decade, has multiple styles. just like today, if you look around the audience, everybody's wearing different style clothes, and the same was true in every generation. So what you're looking for when you're dating clothing are the trends, the popular trends, and so it's often helpful to look for the youngest, most marriageable woman in a photograph because she's dressed to impress. Oops, somehow this has a time on it, and I apologize. So in this case, this is a late 1840s, early 1850s image. And if you look very carefully, you can see that he's got his hair flipped up, probably due to his hat. He's got a tie wrapped around his neck under his collar. And she's wearing a fan-pleated dress. And fan-pleated bodices were popular in the 1840s and sometimes into the early 1850s. She also wears those long curls behind her ears. Those long curls, or spiral ringlets in this case, accent the front of this woman's face, while a slight braid adorns the bun on the back of her head. Those braids are important, and the way they wear their hair is also important. This is also the early 1850s. Oh my goodness, this has a timer on it. The early 1850s, and I know that not just by the way she wears her clothing and the style of the clothing, but the way she wears her hair and the style of the mat, that pebbly texture to it. That tells me it's an early photograph as well. Let's see if I can get ahead of this timer. So those front-facing curls frame the face, and it's hard to know which came first. It's like a chicken or the egg thing. Did the hat styles come first to complement the hairstyles, or did the hairstyles come first and then the hats were designed? In this case, you can see that those curls, or in this case, braids, actually frame the face, and the bonnet goes around those curls, also framing the face. It's a very attractive style. In the 1850s, women wore bonnets tied with great big giant silk ties. And it's hard to know what color she's wearing, because in 19th century photographs, the color can be deceiving. So blue looks white, yellow sometimes looks black, orange looks black, and there were articles to advise women on what colors to wear in the photo studios to complement their coloring. Fashion has a tendency to repeat itself. I don't know about you, but my mom always says, wait long enough and the style of your youth will come back. I guess I've lived long enough because when I go to the mall, I shudder. That hairstyle with the bun in the back and the curls in the front dates all the way back to France in the 17th century. So you have to be careful when you're dating fashion that you don't mix up the big sleeves of the 1890s with the big sleeves of the 1830s. What does this man's hairstyle and fashion say about him? This is an 1850s image, and he's dressed rather, what would you say? His long hair and large sideburns lend an artistic appearance to his demeanor. You can tell just by looking at this photograph that this man is not a conservative banker, a doctor, a lawyer, or a school teacher. He wants to stand out when he walks down the road. He wants people to know who he is and what his job is. In many places in Europe, men still dress for the job, and in places in America sometimes, depending on the job, men dress for the job. In this case, he's dressing for his occupation. This is George Lepard. He was a writer of Gothic novels in the 19th century. There were very interesting hairstyles for men and women in the 1850s. So this woman wears her hair very large puffs on the side of her head, almost like a Princess Leia look, wouldn't you think? And they collected hair and they used forms to create this very beautiful appearance. It says something about her. My great-great-great-grandmother certainly didn't wear this hairstyle. It says that this woman had a professional hairdresser come in and create that hairstyle. And perhaps it was created for a special occasion. Perhaps it's a wedding picture. We don't know because I don't know who these people are. It's an unidentified picture. But it is another daguerreotype from the 1850s. And I know it's from the 1850s based on the hair, the fact that it's a daguerreotype, and that beautiful lace collar she's wearing. Now, also in the 1850s, for men, one of the hairstyles that was popular was for men, young men. This was not a middle-aged or older man style. For men to wear their hair long on the top and gathered into a bun. If you go to Wall Street, you will see that today. And men and women oiled their hair. But those horizontal puffs weren't just for women. This man was saying something about his personality and his fashion sense and his occupation. If only we knew who he was. I actually spent a lot of time looking at photographs in England, and for some reason there's something about his demeanor that makes me think he might be English. It's a daguerreotype. It is that Princess Leia look, and instead of the bun on the top of his head, he's decided to wear two buns, one on either side. It leaves me speechless. In the 1860s, women started wearing their hair behind their ears. They started wearing hairnets. This is a late 1860s photograph based on the braid on her dress, the style of her collar, the style of her hair, and her partner. We don't know if it's a husband and a wife, and they're holding a document that signifies something. But this particular style of clothes worn by this man tells us something about him. It's a long frock coat style, not the short sack coat styles worn by young men in the 1860s. Whoops. It is a long frock coat, and that tells us that he is conservative. And long frock coats in the 1860s were worn by politicians, teachers, bankers, lawyers, doctors, those men for whom had to dress very conservatively to encourage people to hire them. So how long did that hairnet style last? Or what's the earliest I can find that hairstyle in historical books? It dates all the way back to 16th century Italy. So again, fashion has a tendency to repeat itself. So be very careful. Our ancestors had fashion icons. Forget the Kardashians. However, they had Princess Eugenie of France, who was blamed for every fashion innovation that people didn't like. Hoop skirts, for instance. They blamed them on Eugenie. Shirts for women, they blamed that on Eugenie. I think there should be a biography of her as the troubled woman of the 19th century. But in fact, there were other types of icons and fashion icons, women such as Queen Victoria, who lots of women styled their hair like, and women knew what these people dressed like. They knew what these fashion icons in the 19th century looked like and dressed like. This guy is Horace Greeley, the newspaper man. You wouldn't think he'd be a fashion icon, but that under-the-chin beard, he gave a name to it. It was called the Greeley, and he was maligned and caricatured in newspapers all over the country. He was also an abolitionist. Now, we don't know if this man was a follower of Greeley or if he just liked the Greeley style. But in fact, that beard really did start at the chin line and go down from here. It never came above the chin line. This is also the 1860s. So in 1859, there was an innovation in photography called the carte de visite. It's 2.5 by 4 inches, and that's what these last couple of photographs are. So if you see a 2.5 by 4 inch photograph, you can be pretty sure it was taken in the 1860s. This is a man in a hairstyle from the 1870s. How do I know that? I know that from the shape of his tie and style of his tie to the flip, the way he wears his hair, because men in the 1870s wore their hair combed forward or away from their heads. There were a wide variety of beards and mustaches and hairstyles for men throughout the 19th century, including the mutton chop look. So that barber studios had charts, or barbershops had charts, so men could go in and say, I'd like the number 3, please. I'd like that haircut. I'd like the spade beard, please. So everything had a name. This is from the early 1880s. And we're going to jump back just a little bit in this next slide because I just love it, and it gives me an opportunity to talk about tintypes. So tintypes were patented in 1856 and remained popular into the 20th century. But I know that this photograph was taken in the 1870s, particularly the early 1870s or the very late 1860s. I know that from the fascinator on her head, the way she wears that little hat right on her forehead, tipped forward. And these fascinators are still popular today. If you look at the royal wedding photos from a couple of years ago, it was the same type of hat, only more than 100 years later. So how did the average woman dress compared to the fashion plates of Paris? Because all of fashion originates in Paris up to World War II. So I collect fashion magazines, and on the left you see a Paris fashion magazine of all these women in these beautiful hats. Well, American women improvised. They'd go to their milliner and say, I like this hat in this magazine. Can you make it for me, but can you change the ribbon? Can you change whatever? To make it personal. Even women on the frontier knew what the fashions were because they had to uphold the middle class ideal of what family and women was all about. These hats were known as flower pot hats because of their shape. And this fringed chair was popular in the mid to late 1860s, but into the 1870s. And that's what we're looking at here, a picture of somebody from the 1870s. This is a lovely hat from the 1880s, and I included this not just because you can see the style of the hat from that period, but because it has a stuffed bird on the hat. And that stuffed bird, those stuffed birds became even more popular on hats as the 19th century progressed and into the 20th century. And in the 1890s, 4 women from Boston did something. They were outraged. Think of them as early they were thinking about the environment, and they were thinking about birds in general. They founded the National Audubon Society to put a stop to birds and live animals being stuffed to be put in fashion things. But what about the guys? Here's 2 looks from the 1890s. This is like when you look at People magazine and you look at the fashion for one of the award shows, right? They show you who wore it well and who didn't. On the left, we have a man who wears it well. On the right, we have maybe not so good. He's got the comb-over curl thing going on the top of his head. But these are 2 looks from the 1890s. Clean-shaven, mustaches that are trimmed and waxed, and very short hair for men in the 1890s. And in this period, men wore beautiful silk ties. Oops, got ahead of myself. This is what women wore on the top of their heads in the 1890s. They wore little tiny hats. Now again, this is a fashion plate, but in fact, this is what women in America wore as well. So around the world, women, Western-style women, were wearing the styles of Paris. And they would wear little tiny hats on the top of their head. And yes, the woman in the bottom right, that is a big flower coming off the top. By the late 19th century, it was all about the Grecian look, and magazines advised women on how to achieve a Grecian look. In this case, this is a fashion model, and there were fashion models in the 19th century. So our ancestors not only read fashion magazines, but they looked at advertising to see what they should wear and how they should look. To end this presentation, I have included 2 images of sort of the other side of fashion, and you'll see what I mean in just a minute. Okay, more than 50% of women in the 19th century owned a hairpiece. usually made of human hair, but sometimes made from false hair, made out of, what do you suppose? Horse hair? How about yak hair? So if you look at this picture, this is the late 1870s, you can see the natural texture of her hair, and then you can see the fake hairpiece that looks fake, and yet she's a very fashionable woman. The reason she's wearing fake hair is because human hair could cost as anything from $15 to $200 a pound. And so human hair pieces were well outside the range of most women. So they improvised and wore these artificial hair pieces. If you were an older woman and you happened to have thinning hair, or you were losing your hair, there was a style for that as well. You could buy the hat-wig combination and tie it under your chin for when you went out. And that's exactly what this woman is wearing. She doesn't seem to have any hair on the top of her head, but the hat-wig combination covers it. If you've liked my presentation and you'd like to know more about photographs and family photographs and how to identify them, check out my website and sign up for my newsletter. It's free, and I don't sell the list to anybody. Thank you so much.